So they also recognized the sea was a vector for the transmittal of ideas about freedom and individual liberty. And so just the idea of a free sea was adverse to them and their national interests. So they have actively sought Russia in the Arctic Ocean, China in the East China Sea and South China Sea, and Iran in the Arabian Gulf to close those seas, to go from mare liberum to mare closum, to be able to control what enters there.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saroof.
Today we are joined by Dr. Jerry Hendrix, who's a retired Navy captain, having served 26 years on active duty, following his commissioning through the Navy ROTC program at Purdue University. During his career, Hendrix served in a variety of maritime patrol aviation squadrons, as well as on supercarriers and light amphibious assault ships. Through these tours, Dr. Hendrix established a reputation for using history to illuminate current strategic challenges. Following his retirement from the Navy, he has worked as a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security and as a vice president at a Washington, D.C. defense consultancy. He is now a senior fellow at the Sagamore Institute and is the author of 2 books, Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy and To Provide and Maintain a Navy, Why Naval Primacy is America's First Best Strategy. So thanks for coming on Conservative Conversations, Jerry. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Before we get to our interview, I'd like to thank you, the listener, for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is to educate for liberty. So if you'd like to help us in fulfilling that mission, please be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Jerry, as we get started, as Tom was reading your bio, there's certainly a long, illustrious career of service. So I'm sure we and our listeners would love to hear from you about some of the more formative moments in your life and what influenced you to serve in the Navy, as a career and the various moments in your service that led you to the interests that you have now.
Oh, that's a great question, and it's a wide open question. So, my grandfather served in the Navy briefly during World War II. My father served in the Navy during the Vietnam era, although my father did not serve in Vietnam itself. So I'm the grandson and son of a sailor, and so the Navy was always prominent in my life when I was growing up. I remember my father bought me a poster that said Heritage across the top of it, and it showed enlisted sailor holding the hand of his young tow-headed toddler, looking at the USS Constitution in the background, and that hung in my bedroom when I was young. So the Navy was always there culturally in my life from the time that I was very young. Was very proud of my family's service in it. Grew up thinking that I would serve in the military, obviously focused. When I was a junior in high school, a naval officer came into the high school to talk about Navy ROTC scholarships. I grew up in an agrarian community, so I was on a dairy farm, and I crop farmed and milked cows with my father growing up. And so, not really having a strong path towards how I was going to pay for college. And here are these people saying that, I had good SAT scores. I could probably get a scholarship. So I took that and was able to attend Purdue University, a major research and development technology university in the state of Indiana, my home state. I entered actually in aerospace engineering, but because I was not that good in math, I ended up shifting over to political science in my sophomore year, which I was really good at. I could read history and political science fairly quickly and retain it all. Studied that, was commissioned in 1988, went through the flight training school, and then got into the P3 community, really intending to get out of the Navy after only, my first tour. But I fell in love with it, absolutely fell in love with it. Loved the idea of traveling. I love the idea of serving something greater than myself. Had some great examples of servant leaders around me that sort of co-opted me. Had a chance to serve on board the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt, which really was the pivotal moment in my Navy career. I had 2 commanding officers there. One was Captain Ron Christensen, who to me almost was a minor god, just absolutely an incredible leader, who just recently passed away, and I'm going to be participating in his internment at the Naval Academy here in another week. And then the other one was David Archizell, and Admiral Archizell treated me like a son, and really mentored me and continues to mentor me. I saw him just a few days ago. So they convinced me of what it was to be a Navy captain, and that became my career aspiration. And I'll just say very briefly, after that, though, a funny thing happened, which was 9/11. I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, was not in the Pentagon. But after 9/11, my career path sort of changed from an operational focus to a strategic focus. So I began to work on strategic staffs. I did go back and command a squadron and had sort of the normal aviation career path. But I worked for the Chief of Naval Operations, then I worked for the Secretary of the Navy, I worked for the Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, and mostly for Andy Marshall in the Office of Net Assessment, who's kind of a legendary strategist in the Pentagon. And those tours sort of taught me how to think large and strategically, and the importance also of thinking, using my interest in history to inform current strategic dialogues. So that's sort of the things that affected me and how I moved along. I've been retired for nearly 10 years now and working, continuing to work in the strategic community. But it's been just a fantastic. I've never, I would tell you, I've barely worked a day in my life because I've gotten up every morning and loved almost everything that I've done.
That's wonderful. And we will have more questions about long-term strategy, so get ready to give us some of your best analysis. But our audience does have a lot of young people in it, people who are interested in politics in some form or another. And I think for a lot of them, I know this is true for me. That means thinking about military service as well. My dad has served in the military; he's still in the military. And so I'd love to hear what advice you have for young people and our student audience about discerning service in the armed forces.
Well, I think, there's no more profound experience in my life. When I go to my rest, the first line of my obituary was, Jerry Hendrix, a retired Navy captain. I know that. I accept that. In fact, I'm rather proud of that. To be part of an institution that has such a great history and great traditions as the United States Navy, and to have contributed something to that and certainly taken much more back out of it has been profound for me. Again, I remember my daughter was a high school athlete and she made it to the state championships. And I took her aside and I said, I never made it to the state championships. I've never part of a championship team. And she said, no, Dad. You always taught me you were part of the Navy, and that's a championship team. And I was grateful for her to making that observation to me. So if young people are looking for a place to spend a few years of their life contributing to something larger than themselves, whether that's the Navy or if they conceive the nation. In fact, when I was in service, we mentioned quite often that we wore the cloth of the nation. Our uniforms were the cloth of the nation. And so to serve something greater, to submit to authority for the betterment of the public is something that's really important. I now come out having done that, and I have a certain sense of freedom to be able to speak my mind based upon the experiences I gained and the sacrifices I made and the things I participated. I deployed 6 times during my career, 5 times in support of combat operations that my fellow citizens voted on for me to go and do. And I learned a lot from that about where the United States is in the world, what we represent, and what other nations have to offer and what we have to offer. And I'm profoundly grateful to be an American citizen.
Do you have any thoughts on national military service on that note? It's been kind of tossed around as a potential policy proposal by Vivek Ramaswamy, and so that's been kind of something people are discussing as the election is looming and we're in the season. So do you have any strong thoughts on that sort of policy?
I have very strong thoughts, and they're very mixed as well. I was raised by a man who told me that he thought everyone should serve, and of course, my father was drafted. In fact, he talks about when he got his letter from Mr. Johnson, President Johnson, to go and serve. But I will tell you, I felt very privileged that I led a squadron and I served as a department head and as a lieutenant in an all volunteer service. All of my people wanted to be there. They were all volunteers. This is where they wanted to be, and this is what they wanted to do with their life. That being said, I think that there's been times in our nation's history where the idea of spending 2 years or 4 years in national service, whether it's in uniform in the military or if it's in other things that also legitimately are important. I have total respect for colleagues that I've met who served in the Peace Corps and were overseas working on U.S. projects and foreign aid. I'm totally on board with that. But I will tell you, I think that there was a big difference in the military between when 70% of the military was drafted and what I served in, which was 100% of us all wanted to be there. And I definitely prefer the all volunteer force. However, I think it's important to realize that only the United States Marine Corps met its recruitment goals for this past calendar year. Every other military service has fallen short, and in the case of the Army, profoundly short of its recruitment goal.
So a quick follow-up on that note, because I've seen that too, the trends are pretty concerning. Is there what do you attribute that to, the falling short on recruit goals outside of you said, was it the Marines, the only one meeting their recruitment goals?
I think that there's a mixture of reasons for that. First of all, unemployment's very low, employment's very high everywhere that I go, and I travel back and forth from Northern Virginia back to the Midwest pretty much on a monthly basis. So I travel through Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Tennessee, Indiana. I get upwards into Michigan, Illinois. So I'm in that region quite a bit. And there are a number of signs out saying, hire, will interview you today. So there is a low unemployment. I think there's also been a sort of a cultural change over the last couple of years about the military. I'm not a woke warrior. That's not my particular area of analysis with the military. But I will tell you that traditional areas where the military has been recruited is taking a dim view of military service. So the 11 states that were once part of the Confederacy was a prime recruiting ground for the United States Army. And I'm just saying that that's an area where honor cultures and family tradition was very important. The American Midwest and the Plain States, Kansas, Missouri, were areas where services like the Air Force and the Navy have recruited heavily in the past. For some reason, those of us who grow up in the midst of cornfields would like to get away and see blue water, oceans, and foreign lands. So that's the nature of it. And we're not meeting our goals in those areas. And so there may be a perception that the military itself has become too much of a social experiment in many cases, and this has led to a decline in the willingness to serve. I do know members of my own family who have advised members of my generation who served, who had advised their sons and daughters not to go into the military because what they perceive as a rising politicalization of the military overall. That's not my particular area of deep analysis, but this is what I'm perceiving.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I want to turn to some of your writings about the Navy and your knowledge of American and military history. And I wonder if you could give us a brief history of the American Navy, which is a big question, but its role in America's history, its role in our foreign policy, and in creating the concept of what you outline in your book on the principle of the free sea, how we participate in creating the free sea.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that the United States, as a government, was founded as a sea power because the 13 original states were Atlantic states facing the Atlantic and heavily dependent upon Atlantic trade. The concepts of the free sea and free trade across the oceans was integral to the way that they perceived themselves and the economy of the original 13 states. So whether you were in the South and you were a plantation economy, or whether you were in the North and you were a mercantilist, you were dependent on being able to sell your goods either finished goods or raw goods, to European markets. And so that is the reason in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, there is a line there that says that the Congress shall provide and maintain a navy. It's not a should, could, would, maybe. It's shall provide and maintain a navy, because they understood that we were dependent upon free trade across those oceans. And so understand that it's integrated into our DNA. Also, if you read like Washington's farewell address or the writings of the original, the Federalist Papers, you see that the Navy and the need for a strong Navy is there. So this is not something that I kind of made up out of whole cloth. One of the reasons why this is there is that, out of the Enlightenment, which we are a nation of the Enlightenment, the ideas that of our founding, the Declaration, are Enlightenment ideas. We go back to Hugo Grotius, the Dutch jurist who's sort of the founder of the Enlightenment movement, and Grotius talks about this concept of the free sea, that ships and men and nations should be able to trade wherever on the oceans that the wind and their crafts can take them, without being impeded. And so, this is sort of part of the founding principle. If you want to know where the concepts of freedom and liberty come from, they are derivative of some of Grotius's writings about the free sea, or mare liberum, as he called it, the free sea. And so we need to just understand that that's part there, and that our nation, we began to move forward to try and make the free sea a reality in the world. It wasn't until about 1946, but it was aspirational for us that we needed to have a free sea. In fact, if you go back and you look at the times that the Congress actually declared war, you will find that 5, I believe, of the 7 occasions that Congress has voted to declare war were over incidents against trade on the free sea. And so just understand that this is integral to who we are. Now, we have built our Navy up 3 times. We built the Continental Navy during the Revolution. We built the original Navy with the 6 frigates that sort of transformed naval warfare in the world. We built a new Navy, the ironclads, during the Civil War, and then we began to create sort of the modern Navy during the time of Theodore Roosevelt. It's the Theodore Roosevelt era that, in fact, we're still in, because it's because of Roosevelt's investments in the Navy that the 20th century became the American century, that we really came to the fore on the world stage. We became the world's largest economy. We became the world's superpower after World War II. And the Navy was the one who sort of policed that global economic system, the empire of liberty, as Thomas Jefferson once talked about it. So we created that. We made it manifest after World War II. And we maintained a fleet of about 1,000 ships at that time to sort of police that. The problems we're seeing today, and I know we'll probably get a little bit more into this, is because we allowed that fleet to decline. It's presently at 290 ships, I think, as of this morning. That's simply not a large enough fleet to actually police the global economic system that we created, and we're starting to see it fray, degrade, and erode at the edges as authoritarian powers try to step in and close the seas.
So that's a great opportunity for us to get on the topic of China. And when it comes to the high seas, we know that China perhaps is one of the major adversaries, the adversary in the South China Sea. So what is China doing to challenge America's control over the seas today? And is that the primary adversary you see today, or is that just one of a few?
Well, we're actually watching China and Russia and Iran are all moving, not necessarily in direct concert, but certainly they're singing the same tune when it comes to the sea. What they identified, especially after Operation Desert Storm in 1991, was that American control of the sea and its ability to project power ashore from the sea was a danger to them. They're authoritarian states, they're continentalists, meaning that they're sort of land-centric in their strategic view. And what we were able to do in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and ultimately against Iraq in 91 terrified them. Because first of all, we pursued a policy of regime change, that we're here to change out your government, and that we projected that policy from the sea by introducing forces that were largely unopposed. We moved 500,000 troops across 2 oceans to position them in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia without opposition because of our control of the sea. And China and Russia became terrified at that idea. And so they began to invest in a series of anti-access air denial weapons that would push us back from their shores, hold us 1,000 miles or more away from their shores, to make sure that we could not project power into either China or Russia, destabilize their internal governments, and cause regime change there. So they also recognized the sea was a vector for the transmittal of ideas about freedom and individual liberty. And so just the idea of a free sea was adverse to them and their national interests. So they have actively sought Russia in the Arctic Ocean, China in the East China Sea and South China Sea, and Iran in the Arabian Gulf to close those seas, to go from mare liberum to mare closum, to be able to control what enters there. They want to be able to project their land power over the ocean and control who can approach their shores.
Next week, we are doing a debate actually on how America should respond to a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And I'd love to, hear your views on that, especially with an eye to the role that the American Navy plays in protecting Taiwan and protecting the South China Sea more generally, and some of the problems that we're facing there now.
So I've been involved in a number of war games as well as strategic conversations about Taiwan. Our strongest play right now with regard to Taiwan is to try and get as much aid and weapons and material to Taiwan right now. They are totally dependent upon imports of fuel, so they need to fill their fuel bunkers. They are dependent, they need additional missiles. They need a lot of anti-ship cruise missiles. They need a lot of guns. A lot of the same things that we're using in Ukraine, Taiwan's going to need. Now, I'm a strong supporter of aid to Ukraine because we are achieving a significant foreign policy goal right now in weakening Russia in Ukraine. And so I'm not opposed to giving aid to Ukraine, but we do need to understand that we need to build up our industrial base to be able to refill our stockpiles, be able to provide aid to Taiwan. We're now providing aid to Israel. We need to provide aid to Ukraine because our national interests are on the line in all these places. So first of all, we need to strengthen Taiwan in order for it to be able to last after a Chinese move. We will need to arrange ourselves operationally to be able to make an approach to resupply Taiwan. That is a hard thing to do with DF-21 and DF-26 missiles flying that can sink our ships at sea. Probably our best strategic move against China, if they move against Taiwan, is to begin sinking or interdicting Chinese merchant traffic on the world's oceans. We can do that relatively safely. I would just point out China is entirely dependent, as much as Taiwan is, upon the import of raw materials. They need to import their oil. They need to import things like copper ore or rare earth elements. Those things come from overseas. China is very resource poor in its own country. We can interdict those supplies on their way to China and bring the Chinese economy to a screeching halt. I'd also point out China is almost totally dependent because they have no middle class, no consumer class, on the West to buy the things that China builds, whether it's shoes or iPhones or whatever. And so this idea of disengagement from the Chinese economy is something we need to look at. Clearly, China, if it moves against Taiwan, is going to try to take on Taiwan semiconductors and seize that very quickly because that's a major economic tool. That's one of the reasons why I'm very supportive of, for instance, the CHIPS Act that would offshore and sort of create chip manufacturing here in the United States so that we're not dependent on someone who's so vulnerable. But Taiwan's going to be a difficult thing, and there are a number of different strategies that we can use against the Chinese, but all I can tell you is it's going to hurt.
Circling back on another, geopolitical power that's been, one of our foreign policy adversaries. What about the Russian Navy? Is there, what should we know strategically and about the Russian Navy? Because we haven't really heard much about it in our current, in the news cycle. But in what ways are they trying to undermine the free seas?
Well, the Russian Navy is a pale shadow of what it once was. So when I first came on active duty in 1988, the Russian Navy was the second largest Navy in the world and perhaps even as modern as ours. However, its surface force has largely atrophied over the succeeding 30 years, and they have failed to invest in training. Also, they're a conscript force. So the Russians are dependent largely on sailors that come into their fleet and serve in their Navy for about 2 years. So it's not a well-trained Navy. And we've seen signs of that, for instance, with the sinking of the Moskva, a heavy cruiser in the Black Sea last year, as well as the attacks on the Rapuchka class amphibs that were attacked there just in the last few months, as well as the Kilo class diesel electric boat that was attacked in its dry dock. So they're having a lot of, they're suffering a lot of setbacks. However, Russia has made two primary investments in which they are doing extremely well at. One, they build very good nuclear-powered submarines. These are deep diving, very fast, and by the way, increasingly quiet. And I say that as a guy who used to listen to submarines through sonobuoy hydrophones. The Russian submarines are very modern, they're very quiet, and they're very concerning to me because if the Russians flush their fast attack submarine force into the Atlantic, we will have a great deal of difficulty coming to the aid of our European allies in NATO because those boats are very lethal. The Russians have also made significant investments in icebreakers, nuclear-powered icebreakers, armed icebreakers, so they have the ability to essentially control the high north, and they are creating a new economic bridge to the Chinese along the Great Northern Route where they would ship both petroleum and liquefied natural gas from their ports up near Murmansk down and around to Chinese ports so they could keep the Chinese refueled. And we don't have anything that's really certified to operate up there except a declining number of submarines that can operate under the Arctic ice or up in the Arctic Ocean. So it's been actually since the mid-1950s since the U.S. Navy has actually built an Arctic-rated surface warship. So we have nothing that can kind of play up there, and the Russians have a lot that can play in the Arctic. And the Arctic is becoming increasingly important geostrategically in the world.
There's a lot more I think I could ask or we could talk about with Russia and China specifically, but something that is, I think there's a growing sentiment in America about skepticism towards maybe more aid for Ukraine, but or what we should do about Taiwan, for instance. But I think in a lot of these various foreign policy flashpoints, there's a growing tendency of, I think maybe it's war weariness or tiredness of being the policeman on the world stage. And so I think maybe one potential response to a lot of the things that you're saying would be something along the lines of, so, I guess almost so what that the Navy is smaller than it was in World War II. Back then we were fighting the Soviet Union and fighting the Cold War. That's over. We don't need to be the world's police power. And so maybe, we have to, defend America's most strategic interests. So pushing back on China might be very significant as maybe the number one adversary that we face today. But the idea that we need to maintain the free sea, that's not necessarily our job per se. So I'm wondering what you would say to people like that, or what you would tell Americans who are, I guess, tired of having an adventurous interventionist military abroad, stuff like that.
Well, if you don't want an interventionist military abroad, then you need to invest in your Navy. The one problem I have, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote recently my essay in the Atlantic, because we need to be able to talk to everyone in the country about the central importance of the oceans in our daily lives. So if you like Walmart, if you like BJ's Wholesale Club, if you like going to Target, if you go to any of the big box stores, then you must love the United States Navy, because all of the big box items that sort of run our economy come to us across the oceans. The oceans are maintained open as free sea lanes of trade and communications by the United States Navy. We need to understand that 80% by volume, 70% by value of our economy travels by the ocean. Even the 5% of the economy that is in the electronic communications travels along undersea communications cables that have to be protected and maintained by the Navy. So unfortunately, we, the American people, and by the way, this isn't a modern issue, this is a historic issue, we do not think about ourselves geostrategically. We don't understand that we are an island nation, that the northern North American continent is essentially, between two oceans that link us to the vast Eurasian world island, with which we do most of our business and most of our trade and most of our diplomacy. The degree that we are fed, our economy has risen because of global international trade. At the end of World War II, in 1945, the global domestic product was 12.5 trillion. This in 2022, it was over 100 trillion. That is an exponential rise in global domestic product, largely because of free trade and the free seas. International, the level of poverty in the world has gone from like 74% down to less than 10%. Literacy has gone from 40% up to over 80% in the world during this period of transoceanic trade. So when the American people say, hey, we're getting war weary, it's like, okay, that's fine. If you don't want boots on the ground, then invest in your Navy. Give your nation the ability to have offshore influence, to influence events overseas without necessarily getting entangled, to use Washington's great term from his final address, to avoid foreign entanglements. Then invest in your Navy. Take the sea power approach. This is one of my main criticisms, and it's something that I raised in this Atlantic essay. With $33 trillion in debt, we can no longer afford to be all things to all peoples. But that also means that now is the time of choosing, to use the great Ronaldus Magnus's term. Now is the time of choosing. You need to make your decision about what type of nation do you want to be. Do you want to be a continentalist land power, or do you want to be a sea power? We, for 40 years, have tried to be both, and we've exhausted ourselves doing that. I believe that now is the time to create a maritime national security strategy that focuses on the oceans and that would have the United States come to the aid of its allies. We have 50 treaty allies, but we come to them to lend them support from offshore. We will keep the sea lanes of communication open. We will provide them with naval support. We will provide them with power projection from the sea. But please stop asking us to send our boys and girls to be boots on the ground in your countries. If you're Europe, invest more in your own defense. We cannot afford to care more about Europe's security than Europe does. That is a problem where the security conversation in our country is breaking down. I am a full-throated supporter of NATO. I'm a Dwight Eisenhower fanboy, okay? So I'm all in on NATO, but I'm not NATO, okay? We're one part of NATO. Europe is the heart of NATO. We in Canada are on the other side of an ocean from NATO. Europe has to invest in its own security, or else you're going to lose the mom and pop in the Midwest, like my parents, who are like, why are we doing this if they don't care about their own security? Okay, so they need to step up if they want to preserve the alliance, which I do. I want to preserve NATO and I want to remain involved, but we need to be involved at the right level and in the right role.
Jerry, we're unfortunately out of time, but I just want to thank you. I know. We always wish we had like 20 more minutes to discuss, but thank you so much for joining us. And if our listeners want to see more of your work, where can they find your writing, any other podcast appearances, things like that?
Well, I'm first of all, you can find me on X or Twitter at Jerry Hendrix II. I'm actually Jerry Hendrix II, so I put II there after. And also, I'm a senior fellow at the Sagamore Institute in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's kind of where all my articles and essays and podcasts, or for that matter, videos that I appear in, will appear at Sagamore Institute's website. So I suggest that they go and look there.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you, listener, for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to head over to our website, which is at isi.org/resources, to see all that we offer our members, which includes the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, lectures, debates, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.